Great. Well, thank you all so much for coming today. I'm looking forward to telling you about my research, how it started, briefly what I was looking at, and then my main focus for today is to sort of talk about the ideas that I've come up with within the research that I've been doing, and to throw around the idea of some, I suppose, in a way, frameworks and theories that link to what I have been working on. So I will be sharing my a PowerPoint with you all, and I will do that now. So just to let you know that there will be a shift in what you can see on your screen. And bear with me one moment. Now I hope you can all see that. Okay. So clearly, I'm Kirri Dangerfield, PhD student. I am due to be finishing my candidature on the 4th of May, so coming up very soon, and I'm trying to get all of the last little tidbits done well in advance before that time. And I've been looking at the idea of team interpreting. So you may have seen most recently with emergency services, and particularly throughout COVID and the bushfires that have happened over the last little while, that we have Auslan English interpreters and Auslan interpreters on stage with whoever's presenting. And sometimes you'll see them swap over at various intervals. This is what we call team interpreting. So that means where a group of interpreters, 2 or more, work together on any given situation. And over the years, I've been an interpreting practitioner for shy of 20 years now. You can't tell by my face, but anyway. And through that time, the idea of working in a team has changed quite dramatically from when I first started as an interpreter, where working in a team was a novelty. We would mostly work on our own. And the reason, well, the reason of working in teams much more now is twofold. And before I go into that, I should actually swap or change the screen to the next slide. And this is talking about my study. And what I would like to say about team interpreting as being twofold. First of all, one of the reasons of the focus on working in teams is because of occupational overuse syndrome or repetitive strain injury. And that is because when interpreting, you're moving between the 2 languages at the same time in your mind. So you're having input and output happening relatively in a similar time frame. And that produces fatigue on not only your mind and the processing, but also physically with, in particular, working between English and Auslan, because Auslan is a visual spatial language. And so with that, there is also research to say that when interpreting simultaneously or even in a consecutive mode, to work at such a high capacity, a high level of thinking capacity, your output of interpreting does start to reduce dramatically beyond 20 to 30 minutes. Depending, of course, on the context and the pace of the situation and so forth. But in general, the output quality does decline. So this is another reason why we do work in teams of 2 or more. Now, my study was looking at the idea of team interpreting, and I really wanted to know what Auslan English interpreters around the country understood team interpreting to be, what they understood it involved, and how they would go about their own work when they did work with another interpreter. Now, I will place a caveat on my research. I was only looking at hearing interpreters, so interpreters that use English and Auslan. And the reason for that is because I personally didn't have much experience working with deaf interpreters or Auslan interpreters. So I didn't want to embark on a research that I didn't have a background knowledge of, because I felt that that wouldn't have given the most appropriate perspective. And so I focused only on English Auslan interpreters. So I sent out a questionnaire across the country using a snowball effect, starting on social media, various networks that I had, sending that through email and hoping that my contacts would then send that out to their contacts as well. Luckily, Auslan English interpreters here in Australia, there aren't that many. So being able to reach out to as many as possible is quite a good turn. And I received 118 responses out of a potential 900 accredited NAATI interpreters at the time. But sorry, I just got muted. I might just go back a little bit. So the possible 900 NAATI accredited interpreters that could have been reached, that didn't actually take into account the interpreters who are either no longer working in the industry or have very reduced hours, or those that haven't actually re-accredited since. So receiving 118 responses, I think was quite phenomenal, really. Then after that, after I received all of those responses, a few themes came out. And from what I could see is that interpreters are really keen on working in teams, but there's a disparity as to what it looks like and how interpreters can work together in an effective team in an interpreted situation. This then led to me establishing 9 scenarios where I had pairs of interpreters working in each scenario. So altogether there were 18 participants. And the scenario, I had written a script. It was a mediation session. And so there was a deaf manager of an office works company type thing. And the grievance was with the hearing staff member who'd had allegations raised against them. And there was a mediator who was beamed in from Sydney who was also deaf. And so this segment lasted for between 45 minutes to an hour. And I purposefully made it so that there was a computer involved. So there was a screen like what we're doing now. So there was potential for technology failure, potential for disconnection. I also deliberately made some background noise and interruptions happen throughout that time so that the interpreters were put under a stress, which actually replicated your everyday living work environments. And that was to see how the interpreters would support each other through those particular instances when they cropped up. Then after that, after each of the interpreting pairs had completed their assignment, I conducted retrospective interviews with each of the groups to talk about what they had encountered, what they did to prepare for the job, how they prepared with each other, what sort of things they spoke about, and just to garner the overall idea and perspective of what the interpreters thought they were doing and what they were actually doing. So moving on to the next slide. Sorry, I've got two computers happening at once because one has my notes that I'm referring to, and then the other one is what you see on the screen. This one that you can see is the participant groupings. So this is actually quite a good cross-section of interpreters based in Melbourne and their various levels of certification. At the time, it was accreditation through NAATI. And as you can see, there's quite a few people that are at the level 2 or certified provisional interpreter level, and quite a few who are of level 3, and there were some that are level 4. And level 4 is at conference level, which there are only very few Auslan English interpreters who have that accreditation, certification currently. And one of our members has completed a PhD. And also they actually have a dual accreditation. So they have an Auslan English accreditation of interpreting and English in another language as well. Now, what I did find when I was looking at the data was that there were quite a few instances that came out of supports that happened during the interpreted situations. And I categorised them in a variety of ways. First of all, I looked at the interpreters and what role they were taking on. So I've described them as active, monitor, and ego. Ego meaning when the interpreter actually steps out of role and becomes their own person in that situation. For example, if a joke was made, the interpreter might step out of their interpreter mode and laugh. So that's offering their own personality in a way. So that's what I referred to as ego. The active interpreter was the one who was doing the interpreting at the time. The monitor interpreter at the time was the one surveying what's going on and also keeping watch of the other interpreter in case they needed some support in a variety of ways, which could have been there was some missing information, or the active interpreter was looking for an affirmation to keep going with what they were doing because what they were producing was correct. There could have been an instance of needing some clarification of information. There could have been repairs. So the active interpreter might have signed or spoken something and then had to have gone back because they had said something that wasn't quite accurate, so needed to repair that at the time. The mode of interaction, how the interpreters interacted together, was they could have spoken to each other. It could have been one word. It could have been a sentence. They could have signed to each other. Well, they could have used both if they were, if they had stopped the interaction between the interlocutors. They could have used both English and Auslan if it was a very brief interaction, just to make sure everybody was on the same page if they needed to come back to a concept. The interpreters could have used written information as well, and or head nods. So like I was saying before, if the active interpreter looked at the monitor interpreter for maybe some encouragement, then a head nod would have been used. And I categorised the supports that came up as either solicited or unsolicited, meaning the active interpreter knew they needed some information, so they indicated in a variety of ways to the monitor interpreter they needed some support at that time. Unsolicited was when the monitor interpreter offered information without being asked for it. Now, I will be talking a little bit about the differences that I saw, but very briefly, because obviously, like I was saying before, my main concern about today is to talk about the finding, well, the overarching framework and theoretical ideas that are linking to my project. But anyway, what I did find was the groups of interpreters who didn't know each other very well. So I had 4 groups of interpreters who hadn't worked together before or very rarely, and 4 groups of interpreters who were very used to working with each other in a variety of settings. So they obviously had a familiarity with each other. The ones who weren't familiar with each other, actually, I saw much more unsolicited prompting and supports rather than solicited, whereas it was the opposite when interpreters who were familiar with each other, well, the way they were working. And that's not a right or wrong. That's just an interesting difference to take into account, and the potential reasons of why this could have been. Maybe those who are familiar with each other are more able to sit back, the monitor interpreter is able to sit back and wait until they know that the other interpreter has said, I need some information here. Whereas those who don't know each other very well haven't yet been able to find out the nuances of what either interpreter needs at the time. So that's a possibility, one of the reasons why the solicited and unsolicited prompts were occurring very differently between the groups. And one group, the final group, they actually came up with no prompts at all. And they have worked together before, but they had very, very different styles of working. So in that respect, there was a mismatch there. And for maybe a whole list of reasons why they didn't prompt each other, maybe they didn't need it, maybe the way they worked, the way each individual worked was so different from each other that it was impossible to provide support in a meaningful way. But that's for a whole nother PhD. I could just take that one instance and I could certainly write at least one more PhD regarding why or why not prompts were not being utilised. Now, I'm just going to move on to teamwork. So as I said before, working in teams is relatively new in the interpreting industry, particularly Auslan English interpreting. And I needed to figure out what teamwork actually means. What does it entail? How do people understand this idea of teamwork? And for me, it just, what I was finding wasn't quite suiting the whole idea of how interpreters work together. So I'm just going to move to the next slide, which shows you a couple of different models of working in a team. And these are all talking about where the team members, it might be a group of 5, it might be a group of 10, they all have their own responsibilities within that team. Yes, everybody is working towards the same goal, which is true for interpreters, but everybody has a slightly different role or responsibility within this team so that they can all get to the end point and achieve the same thing. But with all of these teamwork models, they rely on the fact that teams work together over a long duration of time. And so that means maybe they're meeting up at least once a week, maybe they all work at the same workplace. And so everybody has an understanding of each other and how they work and what their role is at the time. And so it takes a long time for them to get to the end product, which means there's more opportunity to develop rapport with each other to develop that working relationship. Whereas with interpreters, our working life is predominantly casual or on a freelance basis. So it means I could probably work with an interpreter today, and then I won't see that interpreter for maybe another 6 months or a year or even longer. So what we've established on that particular day in that short period of time that we're working together might not necessarily be effective the next time I see them in the distant future. So there's that disconnect with what I found with all of these teamwork models. So it brought me to thinking, if these models aren't really suiting the idea of interpreters working in teams, I started to wonder about the word team. I've heard different terms being used across the globe. Sometimes you hear it being described as co-interpreter or co-worker or tandem interpreter. But the word tandem gives an inference that the interpreters are working simultaneously, doing exactly the same thing. And to me, that doesn't quite work out either, although tandem means there's a support going on there. So I can understand why that word is being used. Anyway, so that brings me to my next slide, which is talking about the idea of temporary teams. There's a lot of assumption when a temporary team comes together. And I feel like this really suits the idea of interpreters working in teams on any given day, because there's this inherent trust that I am a qualified NAATI credentialed interpreter, and so is the other interpreter that I am working with on the day. There is an understanding that I have a certain skill level. Me at the level of, I'll say level 3 interpreter, and if my team interpreter is level 2, I have a generalized understanding that they may have less experience than me in this particular setting. So the supports and in my schema, I think the supports I will offer them might be different to somebody that I know has been working longer in the field. And there's this whole idea of trust. But trust generally needs to be developed over time. And so I'm still grappling with this idea of trust, but I do believe that temporary teams describes more of the situation that interpreters are working in. So that's for further discussion at a later stage, and maybe another PhD. Looks like I'll be studying for the rest of my life, as I'm sure all of you are too. Then I started to think about, well, interpreters are essentially communication specialists. We have a deep understanding of 2 different languages, 2 different cultures, and how we can bridge those 2 to come together and have a meaningful interaction. But this idea of, yes, we have the ability to do so, but the idea of us working in a team most effectively, there's a couple of things missing that we need to figure out how we can overcome those missing parts or fill in those gaps so that we can then start working as a team to the end goal and have a shared understanding of that goal, and everybody in the room be on the same page. So as we know, working in a team, it's not an automatic thing. There has to be some level of training to be able to understand all the small details that we need to know that are involved in working as a team. And as I said before, because interpreters work predominantly on a freelance capacity or casual capacity and varied hours and locations, we actually become quite time poor. And so that reduces our ability to develop that teamwork relationship with each other, because we don't have enough time to prepare with each other, or even sometimes we don't receive the preparation information till the 11th hour, if at all, sometimes. So there's a lot of things that are working against us in order to work as an effective team. There isn't any real specific training. I mean, there's some training programs that have been established over the last few years, but there's nothing like, for example, to become an interpreter here in Victoria, we apply to RMIT to get into the interpreting course, and that prepares us for the NAATI examination to receive accreditation at the end of it. So when I'm saying there's no specific training, that's what I mean. There's no specific training about how to work in a freelance casual capacity interpreting team. And there's not yet a common language that all interpreters are using in order to describe the way I work, the way the other interpreter works, and how we can come together so that I can effectively support the other interpreter and they can effectively support me, particularly if we have different ways of working. On a slightly different note, I've been looking at the idea of performativity. So interpreters, even though we're not robots, we bring our own histories, we bring our own understanding of the world and the way we see things. So of course that is going to influence the way we interpret. But as interpreters, we are not there as full participants of the interaction. So there's a bit of a funny role that we play. We're there, we're present, and at times, like I was saying before, we can step out of our interpreting role and offer a giggle or give a side glance or something that is outside the realm of the interpreting role. But what we're doing is we're not actually working with our own thoughts and our own opinions and ideas on life. We're actually working with the interlocutors, their opinions, their ideas of what is going on around the world, what's going on in the world around them, sorry. And so this idea of performativity, and also combining that with the idea of authenticity and interpreting faithfully, we have to somehow the person's views of the world. So that can be quite discombobulating at times. There could be something that I'm interpreting that I inherently disagree with. So essentially, how is that going to impact on the way I interpret that information? So this idea of performativity has really influenced the way I'm looking at how interpreters work, and also outside of the scope of this PhD, thinking about why interpreters accept an assignment or why they don't. And sometimes interpreters need to think about if their worldview is actually in conjunction with the worldview of the assignment or of the interlocutors of the assignment, and whether or not they can provide the most faithful and accurate interpreting that they can without having that other influence of our own views. So with that in mind, I was thinking about the interpreters and their dynamics, because obviously, like I was saying, we all have our own worldview, our own experience of everything that's happening around us. to us, to others? And how does that relate to the interpreter individuals being able to connect with each other on the same level and be on the same page? There's also an idea of interpreting preferences. So I mean in ways of working. The way I work, I have what I call a longer processing time of information. So there's been an utterance, and it takes me a little bit longer to then formulate it into the other language. Whereas another interpreter might have a very short processing time. And so with those differences and preferences, how am I best going to support the other interpreter and vice versa? And then I was also thinking about the importance of pre-assignment discussions. So the preparation. We need to ensure that we are on the same page with maybe the terminology that's being used for the day, maybe the deaf person's sign preference or the hearing person's word choice preference. So there's so many things that we need to discuss before the job, but like I was saying before, we don't generally have enough time to do that. So how do we get around that? Then I started thinking about, okay, we have various interpreting models that we utilize, to think about our work. And so there's been quite a few over the years. Some are really focusing on the practical processing that happens with interpreting. So the technical side of things, what is going on inside my brain when I receive information and how I deliver that information. So looking at Coakley's socio-linguistic model of interpreting, of the process there. There's also the communication binding context. What is happening between interlocutors? So if you've removed the interpreter, if there's two interlocutors that share the same language and culture and community, what is it that they're doing to make sure they're being understood? And then if you bring an interpreter in, how do we ensure that those interlocutors are understanding each other in the way that they both are wanting and needing? Then on the other side of the slide, we look at more of the, so we move away from the process, we look at the other stuff, the stuff that's going on around the process of interpreting. So we look at this idea of, down on the bottom right-hand corner, unconscious incompetence. When I was talking about before, I was talking about the different levels of accreditation or certification. And this works with, as you move through your years of experience and your developed knowledge and understanding of the interpreting process, and also interpreting situations, you will go through stages of competence, whether it be conscious or unconscious. And throughout our careers, we move through these 4 quadrants at any given time. So thinking about that, whether or not I'm conscious of the interpreting choices I make, whether I omit information for a reason that maybe it's superfluous, maybe it's not actually adding to the point of the conversation, or if I add some information, maybe some background knowledge that I have, that might be conscious. I might be doing that consciously because of the end result or the goal of the interaction. Maybe I unconsciously do it. Maybe there's too much information coming to me from the source language and I can't keep up with that. So there is some information that I will have to, because of my own capacity, that I will have to omit or hold on till later on, if I have the opportunity to bring that back in. And then we also think about, okay, I've done an interpreting job, and like most people, not just interpreters, but most people in general, when you think about an interaction that you've had or a job that you've done, you always remember the mistakes. And usually, if we think about constructive criticism, it's always the things that we could improve on. So that's what we as interpreters do. We think about an all-day job that we've been booked on, and then afterwards, I consider or I reflect on my job that I did as an interpreter. And the things that I can remember are the things that I go, oh, if only I'd have done it this way, or oh, I forgot to add that bit in, or I didn't do this particularly well, or there was a bit of a breakdown in communication because I didn't have an understanding of what they were talking about, or I hadn't yet set up a schema to have that understanding, or I didn't do the preparation that I needed to. So a whole list of things, and that's only to mention a few, that can impact on the way that we work. So this idea of DCS, which is demand control schema, it takes away the personal of the interaction. So I can reflect on the interaction and take a step back and look at it as objectively as I can, and break it up into various quadrants of looking at, well, what were the environmental issues, demands? What were they? What things did I have control over? What could I change to make the interpreting process easier? Interpersonal, what was going on between the interlocutors? What's going on between myself and the other interpreter? Paralinguistic, that kind of speaks for itself. Intrapersonal, what am I bringing to the job that day? What's happened to me that morning? Did I come out of a job that was heavy information, or did I come out of a job that I did really well at and I move into the next one feeling bright and snappy and ready to go? So we can use this as I guess, a framework to look at what was happening on the job at the time when we reflect upon it later. And we can also use it as a what if, so prior to getting to the job. So when thinking about all of this, I've actually come up with my own sort of theory on where these models fit in and how interpreters work with these various models throughout their stages of their work experience. And this is really what I wanted to show you, and I know I'm almost at time, so I'll try and be brief but concise and clear. I'm thinking about new interpreters who just received their qualification. They've got their piece of paper from NAATI to say, you have accreditation, go forth and work. And if we put on this the lens of team interpreting, so a brand new interpreter walks into a job with a more experienced interpreter. The brand new interpreter is focused on the interpreting process, how that's working. So all of the other stuff that's going on around them is not coming into their consciousness yet, because the fluency, the competence of the actual process of interpreting has not yet come to a level of just being able to do it and then being able to expand on the other stuff that's going on around them. Hopefully that makes sense. Then we move up a level to interpreters have been practicing for a little while. They've got some more experience and starting to be able to let go of that focus on the interpreting process itself only, because they have a proficiency now of being able to use that. It's like riding a bike. You're very focused on, okay, the pedals need to move. I need to be holding onto the handles, until later on, after you've been training and training and training, you might even be able to let go of the handlebars and you can still go down the road without falling off. So it's that sort of analogy, I suppose. And then when we move into the experienced interpreters, that's where the reflective practicing, the demand control schema, and various other forms of reflection come into play. Because we're able to have an understanding of the work that we're doing, how we're doing it, and now we can actually step back and look at what is going on around us. Then when we're thinking about team interpreting success, when you can high five your interpreter team and say, we did a great job, we got through all of this, the interlocutors were happy with the interaction that they've had, done and dusted. But having said that, interlocutors, and they have mentioned this to me before, need to have a trust with the interpreters that they're working with. And because we work in a freelance fashion, casual life, sometimes the deaf people or the hearing people I work with, I've never met before. So it goes back to this idea of developing trust, familiarity with somebody else and their views of the world. It can mean that there is a bit of a jarring with how things are interpreted and how the information is coming across. And sometimes I've had some deaf people tell me that they have to change their use of language dramatically so that they can be comfortable that the hearing interpreter understands them. So then I was thinking, okay, well that's a burden of responsibility on the interlocutors when all they want is to be able to have a meaningful conversation with somebody that doesn't share their language, doesn't share their culture, and then be on their way. That there doesn't need to be this whole pressure of, oh, we have an interpreter in the room, I have to change the way I speak or the way I sign so that I can make sure my message is going to get across in the easiest way possible. So I was thinking, as interpreters become very experienced experts in the field, reflection and the utilization of understanding their own needs as an interpreter with support, with maybe I've worked with the other interpreter regularly, so we know how each other works, we know how we can support each other. And this comes back to how I can articulate what is going on for me. So when I was mentioning before, my processing time is a lot longer than, say, another interpreter's processing time. I'm able to articulate, when these things happen, this is what I need from you. And so when I think about the optimal team interpreting, which is what we're all trying to strive for, as well as the goal of the interaction to be met, is that everybody is on the same page. The interlocutors don't even need to think about the interpreters because the interpreters have it. They know what's going on with each other, with the situation, and the interaction can happen as smoothly as possible without there being a burden of responsibility of changing the way somebody talks or changing the way somebody signs. And so this is my model that I've come up with. Of course, there's a lot more detail that I could go into, but for the essence of time and also for your questions and comments and conversation, I think what I might do is invite all of you to come back on screen in just a moment. And also, if we do run out of time today, please feel free to contact me. I'm more than happy to take this offline and talk more because that's what we do. And I really appreciate any of your insights, your perspectives. And here's a bit of light reading that I offer people. So if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint, I'm more than happy to give that over to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hopefully I'll get to see all of you on screen come up in a moment. And over to you.
Thank you, Kirri. So, yeah, we've got, 10 or perhaps 15 minutes available discussion time. So who would like to start?
Well, can I just say that was utterly fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating and wonderful things I've ever heard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ramas, I think you wanted to.
I just want to Ken Ramis, sorry. Thank you. Hi, Kirri. Thank you very much for that presentation. That was great. It really interested me. I myself am a deaf.
Sorry, froze.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so I myself am a deaf interpreter, as I said before, and I understand team interpreting issues as well as RSI and occupational health and safety. That aside, as an Auslan teacher as well, RSI plays an important part of my life, and a lot of deaf people who work as Auslan teachers also have these RSI injuries because they're working 3 hours straight. They're not team teaching. So they're using their arms in that sense, as well as their minds. So they're also experiencing those injuries. So I think you should also broaden that to Auslan teachers, not only Auslan interpreters. I just want to pin you now, Kirri, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, Kirri. I'd like to respond in Auslan to Ramis. Ramis, you're quite right. When it comes to sign language, that whole that mode of communication impacts all people in regards to RSI, their activity. And the additional burden on the interpreter, there could be so many interpreters I know because of the stress factors and the fatigue working between two languages, that has an exacerbating effect upon the physical body as well as the mind. So you're right, anyone can have a physical injury when it comes to RSI, including Auslan teachers who are teaching Auslan for 2-3 hours straight without a break. They're not team teaching. So interpreters are working in teams, but that's where it's up to the teacher to ensure that there's some type of student-led activities, or there's breaks for the teacher, or within the schedule that they work out times so they have those breaks, those natural breaks or forced breaks from the actual activity of teaching sign language. But certainly, thank you for raising that point. It's worth considering.
Other questions or comments? So Maria also apologizes not being able to go on screen. She says, phonetic teaching also puts an incredible strain on the voice. I have to do vocal exercises in the seminar when I'm teaching sounds of the world language, and still my voice is quite sore for a day after teaching the subject. So perhaps this, perhaps Maria's point is that this is a more general issue.
It certainly can be. And look, I know that a lot of us use our voices all day long. Sometimes I find by the end of the day, if I've been working from Auslan to English all day, Maria, I feel the same as you. My voice sometimes needs a bit of a break. I guess with the point of repetitive strain injury or occupational overuse is that the impact of that on interpreters greatly reduces their working capacity hours. So that means that with our already small pool of interpreters that we have, that reduces even more. And so that means those who are wanting interpreters, the demand of needing an interpreter greatly outweighs the supply. So in addition to, which I didn't mention before, is the constraints that we're working under with that. And that was my main reason for mentioning that issue. And you're right, having those moments to be able to do the exercises so that we can work over the longevity of time without coming across injury.
Good. Other points that people would like to make, or questions that people would like to raise, perhaps around the team aspect. I imagine that, well, just something that occurred to me while I was listening to the talk, that teamwork is obviously something that is good and has many benefits, but you know, it I guess also going to add some things. But I see there's a question from Melanie. Do you have some ideas about how to get around some of the challenges which can decrease the effectiveness of team interpreting? For example, lack of preparation time, lack of relationship with other interpreters, clients, etc.
Yes, thanks for that question, Melanie. I suppose there's a lot of things that we could do to improve being able to have preparation time, have the preparation information, have those conversations with our interpreter team that we're working with and the interlocutors as well. The one thing that I've really found with the lockdown is that interpreting has become, like everything else, it's all become online. And so with all of these ideas of being able to support each other in a variety of ways that I briefly mentioned before, sort of got thrown out the window, because now we're again working in a silo situation, for want of a better concept, because I'm in my own home office, the other interpreters in their home office, and we switch our videos on and off at various intervals when we're changing over. So there's a reduced ability to be able to support each other unless we have 3 different devices happening all at the same time. We've got our team interpreter on Skype, we have our phone with FaceTime if we need it, or various other ways of being in contact with each other, while all at the same time we're using the app of the interaction. And what I did notice were that, well, agencies have a role to play in this, is whether or not there's an ability to pay for our time so that we do have that half an hour before the job to have that catch-up brief session with our team interpreter. But what I also noticed during lockdown was that agencies were putting onto the booking record the phone number of my team interpreter. So I had the opportunity to call them and have a conversation at an appropriate time. And I think prior to that, there was a lot of mystery with interpreters not wanting to give out their phone number to their team interpreter for want of whatever reason it may be. But being able to contact our other interpreter has made a huge difference. And whether or not interpreters are taking that up, again, that could be an issue that we need to iron out. So, and the lack of time is, interpreters are very responsible for their own diaries in a lot of ways. And it is difficult when you've got one booking in the morning, you have an hour in between that you have to race from that job over to the other side of town to start the next job. So we need to be mindful of having enough break time so that we can do those preparations and give ourselves enough time in order to make sure that we have all the information we need to do the best job that we can. And I think that's really difficult because, like I was saying before, there's not enough of us. So we're spreading ourselves thin to try and accommodate for all of the demand that is out there. So I suppose it's a long-term work in progress.
Okay, well, yes, all of our work is a long-term work in progress. And your particular task of completing your PhD is a long-term work which is coming to its conclusion, which is wonderful. So look, we still have a minute or so if anyone else wants to raise another point, either in the chat or in the personally. I think that Ramas has already left. So, and Paul, I imagine you'll be leaving us in a second as well. So thanks.
That's right. Thank you, Stephen.
If there's no other comments or questions, can we all again thank Kirri in the modern Zoom methodology. And I'll be in touch with everyone. I think everyone on this mailing list is on our mailing list about our next seminar, which will be a couple of weeks away at least. So thank you all. And Kirri, I think that was terrific. So good. So
Thank you.
end the meeting so that I can now get the video. I'm going to end the video first. Should stop that first. Hold on.